Hello everyone, and thank you for attending today's staff meeting where we will be talking about appropriate and culturally responsive resources that should be included in our Stage 4 science classrooms. Today I acknowledge that I'm talking to you all on the lands of the Gadigal people who have and continue to sustain this beautiful place for me. I recognise their continuing connection to the land and waterways and thank them for caring for country for thousands of generations. I also acknowledge and offer my deepest respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all First Nations people present today. The resource I want to talk to you about is called Young Dark Emu, A Truer History. This critically acclaimed book, written by Bruce Pascoe, challenges the entrenched white-dominated narrative that pre-colonial Aboriginal Australians were hunter-gatherers, by providing early settler accounts which prove that they are instead the first Australian agriculturalists and scientists. This resource also provides insights into Aboriginal cultural knowledge and practices which underpin and are relevant to Western science understandings. These interrelated concepts communicated in Pascoe's book relate to the Stage 4 Living World syllabus topic that addresses aquatic and terrestrial resource management strategies and the effective science on the environment. The specific topics in this resource that I recommend should be addressed when covering the Living World syllabus include the introduction and aquaculture, fire, and agriculture topics. As this resource authentically communicates Aboriginal scientific and cultural knowledge to students, I would recommend that other sections are used for different science and cross-curricular topics too, including history and geography. Although this book is confronting, it is important to incorporate it in lessons, as it asks young readers to consider a different version of Australia's history, pre-European invasion, challenges entrenched stereotypes and narratives surrounding Aboriginal Australians, and challenges students to learn about Indigenous knowledge systems which can differ from Western science. For these reasons, prior to embedding this resource in classrooms, it is important that us teachers consider completing a turning policy into action template, as it can prompt our development of practical methods to embed Aboriginal knowledge in our classrooms and wider school community. As this resource covers some confronting and challenging topics for Stage 4 students, it is important that student wellbeing is at the forefront of our minds when including this resource in science classrooms, especially Indigenous learners' wellbeing. This means that we should monitor and be attentive to student reactions on these topics. As teachers, it is crucial that we are aware of how our meta-narrative and use of language when talking about Indigenous peoples can objectify and dehumanize First Nations people, as this can cause significant impact on Indigenous students' cultural identity. It is also important that we don't implement this resource with a tick-the-box mentality or through tokenistic approaches or practices, as this can cause resistance from students. Rather, it is important that we use culturally responsive approaches such as the Aboriginal 8 Ways of Learning pedagogy framework to meaningfully embed Young Dark Emu in science-based activities which reflect intellectual rigour. For example, teachers and students could create a learning map using symbols and images to holistically visualise the pathways of knowledge and lesson tasks that will be performed when learning about the creator spirit emu, the army, and how this relates to seasonal and astrological Indigenous knowledge, which is quite complex. I have developed a plan of why and how this resource should be implemented in our classrooms, which I can go into further detail with you all about after this meeting. But I also find it important to remind you that we are mandated to adhere to policy requirements, more specifically ACARA's cross-curriculum priorities, which outline that students should learn about First Nations perspectives, histories and science knowledge, as well as AITSL's Professional Standard 2.4, which focuses on promoting respect and understanding towards First Nation people as it can promote reconciliation between Australians. As a proud Warramai woman, I believe that this resource should be included in lessons as it engages in truth-telling, and from an ethical standpoint, this is important as it accurately represents pre-colonial Aboriginal people and culture, which unfortunately isn't often the case in historical recounts. To be specific, this resource constructs Aboriginal people as the first scientists and explains how they utilise science-based practices to develop sustainable aquaculture systems. This resource should be embedded in classrooms through developing ongoing and reciprocal relationships with local Aboriginal education consultative groups and Aboriginal communities. This can enable student engagement in meaningful and culturally responsive learning practices such as yarning circles, where students discuss and ask questions about these aquaculture practices. Additionally, this resource shows how Western science reflects and is underpinned by Aboriginal science-based traditions and customs, which supports, as mentioned by Martin Nakata, that contemporary Western scientific knowledge has been woven through Dreamtime stories and traditional Indigenous practices. This notion that Indigenous and Western science overlaps and complements each other is important, as it's crucial that all students understand the continued relevance of Indigenous knowledge, culture, and practices. Thank you all for your time, and I look forward to discussing this resource with you all in the future. Thank you.